Medusa gleamed like a dull ball bearing far below as Fearless slid into her assigned parking orbit for rendezvous with Warlock. It wasn't much of a planet, Honor thought, watching it on the visual display. She was well aware her concentration on Medusa stemmed from a need to think about anything but her upcoming interview with her senior officer, but her mood had little to do with her conclusion that Medusa had to be the most boring-looking world she'd ever seen. It was gray-green, relieved only by the weather patterns and the glaring white of massive polar ice caps. Even its deep, narrow seas were a barely lighter shade of the omnipresent gray-green, a soupy sludge of plankton and larger plant forms that thrived in a brew the environmental control people would have condemned in a heartbeat back on Sphinx. Medusa's axial tilt was extreme, over 40 degrees, which, coupled with its cool primary, produced a climate more brutal even than Manticore B. Griffin. The planetary flora was well adapted to its severe environment, but it showed an appalling lack of variations, for Medusa was covered in moss, thousands, millions of varieties of moss, short, fuzzy moss in place of grass, higher growing bushy moss in place of bushes, even, God help us all, great big floppy mounds of moss in place of trees. She'd heard about it, even seen hollows, but this was the first time she'd seen it with her own eyes, and it wasn't the same at all. She gave a wry grimace of distaste and turned her eyes resolutely to the sight she'd been avoiding. HMS Warlock floated in the same orbit, barely 100 kilometers clear, and she swallowed a bitter-tasting envy mixed with old hatred as she gazed at her. The Star Knight class was the Royal Manticore Navy's latest heavy cruisers, 3.5 times more massive than Fearless, and with almost 6 times her firepower, even before Hephaestus and horrible Hempel had butchered her. The big, sleek ship hung there, taunting Honor's elderly command with its mere presence, and knowing who commanded that beautiful vessel made it far, far worse. She'd thought she'd hit bottom when they'd assigned her to the Basilisk station. Now she knew she had. The duty helmsman brought Fearless to rest relative to Warlock, and she drew a deep breath, wondering if any of her crew guessed why she'd left Nimitz in her quarters. Not that she intended to tell them. "Call away my cutter, please," she requested. "Mr. Venizelos, you have the watch." "Aye, ma'am," Venizelos replied, and watched curiously as his captain stepped into the lift and headed for the boat bay. Honor sat silently, her arms folded as her cutter crept across the emptiness between Fearless and Warlock. She'd been tempted, in a way, to use one of her penances, but she knew why, just as she knew that that particular bit of ostentation would have been one too many. So she'd taken her cutter, despite the fact that it moved far more slowly than a pinnace would have. Even the most efficient thrusters gave a much weaker acceleration than impellers, and her cutter was too small to mount an impeller drive. It was also too small for the inertial compensator needed to offset an impeller's brutal power, though its gravity generator can compensate for the lower g-force of its thrusters. Yet, despite Honor's own impatience and need to get this over with, the trip was short, even at the cutter's relatively slow speed. Too short. She'd spent the last 31 hours dreading this moment. Her pilot completed his final approach, and the cutter shivered as Warlock's tractors captured it. It rolled on its gyros, aligned itself with the heavy cruiser's inertial gravity as the brilliantly lit cavern of Warlock's boat bay engulfed them, then settled into the docking cradle. Alloy clanged gently as the hatch collars mated, and the green pressure light glowed. She was alone, and she allowed herself a sigh as she stood and tucked her beret under her epaulette. Then she tucked the skirt of her tunic down, squared her shoulders, and walked briskly through the opening hatch and down the tube into the twitter of bosun's calls and the salutes of the side party. Young hadn't come down to welcome her in person, she saw. She supposed it was a calculated insult. It was the petty sort of gesture at which he excelled, but she was relieved by his absence. It gave her a chance to settle herself and get her inner defenses in place before the inevitable confrontation. She stopped in front of the short, squared-off commander heading the side party and saluted. "Permission to come aboard, sir?" she asked. "Permission granted, Commander Harrington." He returned her salute, then extended his hand. "Paul Tankersley, Warlock Success." His voice was deep and resonant, his clasp firm, but there was an edge of curiosity in his sharp eyes. Honor wondered if he'd heard rumors about her and Young. "If you'll accompany me, Commander," Tankersley went on after a brief pause, "the captain is waiting in briefing 1. Lead on." She made a tiny gesture for him to precede her, and the two of them walked through the side party to the waiting lift. There was no small talk on the way, which, Honor reflected, probably did indicate that Tankersley knew at least a little about her. After all, he could hardly begin a conversation with, "Do you and the captain still hate each other's guts, Commander?" Nor could he ask for her sign of it without seeming disloyal to his own commanding officer. Under the circumstances, a prudent silence was undoubtedly his wisest course, and she felt her lips twitch with acid amusement as the lift slid to a halt. "This way, Commander," Tankersley said, and she followed him down a short passageway to the briefing room hatch. He came to a halt, pressed the admittance button, and stood aside as the panel slid open. She thought she saw just a touch of sympathy in his expression as she walked past them. Captain Lord Young was seated behind the conference table, perusing a sheet of hard copy. He didn't look up as she entered, and she gritted her teeth, amazed that such a trivial insult could make her so angry. She crossed to the table and stood silently, determined to wait him out. He was the same flashy, handsome man he'd always been, she noted, putting on a little weight perhaps, but the short beard hid his insipid double chin quite well, and his tailoring was excellent. It had always been, even at the academy, where everyone was supposed to wear the same Navy-issue uniform. But, then, the rules never had applied to him. Pavel Young was the eldest son and the heir of the Earl of North Hollow, a point he had no intention of allowing anyone to forget. Honor had no idea what he'd done to get himself banished to Basilisk Station. Perhaps, she thought bitterly, he'd simply been himself. Patronage could advance an officer's career. Witness the fact that Young, who'd graduated only one form before here, had made the list 5 years ago. Once an officer's name was on the captain's list, his eventual flag rate was guaranteed, unless he did something so drastic that fleet cashiered him. He only had to live long enough for simple seniority to see to that. But rank, as many a Manticoran officer had discovered, was no guarantee of employment. An incompetent usually found himself on half-pay, still carried on the active duty list but without a command. Half-pay was supposed to provide a reserve of experienced officers against future need by retaining those surplus to the service's current requirements. In practice, it was used to put fumble-fingered idiots too important to dismiss from the Queen's service where they could do no harm. Obviously, Young hadn't gotten himself into that category yet, but the fact that he'd been senior officer in Basilisk for almost a tearing year now seemed a pretty clear hint someone at the Admiralty was less than thrilled with his performance, which, no doubt, was only going to make him more poisonous than ever to deal with. He finished pretending to read his hard copy and replaced it fastidiously on the tabletop, then raised his eyes. "Commander," the tenor voice was smooth, draping his enmity like a velvet wrapped around a dagger's blade. "Captain," she returned in the same emotionless tone, and his mouth twitched in a brief, almost smile. He did not invite her to sip. "I'm relieved to see your ship. We've been even more short-handed than usual since Implacable left." Honor contented herself with a silent nod, and he tipped his chair back. "As you know, Basilisk Station is chronically understaffed," he went on, "and I'm afraid Warlock is sadly overdue for refit. In fact, this," he tapped the hard copy, is a list of our most urgently required repairs." He smiled. "That's why I'm so pleased to see you, Commander. Your presence will permit me to return Warlock to Manticore for the yard attention she needs so badly." He watched her face, and Honor bit the inside of her lip and fought to keep her dismay from showing. If Young was dispatching his own ship to Manticore, he undoubtedly intended the ship to Fearless. The mere thought of sharing her bridge with him was enough to turn her stomach, but she managed, somehow, to stand in attentive silence with no sign of her thoughts. "Under the circumstances," he continued after a moment, "and in view of the extensive nature of our needs, I felt it would be inadvisable to ask Commander Tankersley to assume responsibility for Warlock's refit." He extended a data chip and smiled as she took it without touching his hand. "Therefore, Commander Harrington, I will be accompanying Warlock back to Manticore to supervise her refit in person. This time her surprise was too great to hide completely. He was the station's senior officer. Did he mean he intended to abandon his responsibilities for the system? I will, of course, return as quickly as possible. I realize my absence will be inconvenient for you, and I will make every effort to keep it as brief as possible, but I estimate that the necessary maintenance and repairs will consume at least 2 months. More probably. He smiled again. 3. During that time, you will be senior officer here in Basilisk. Your orders are on the chip. He let his chair slip back upright and picked up his hard copy once more. That will be all, Commander. Dismissed. Honor found herself back in the passage outside the briefing room without any clear memory of how she'd gotten there. The data chip cut into her palm with the pressure of her grip, and she made herself relax her hand one muscle at a time. Commander. She looked up, and Commander Tankersley recoiled. Her dark eyes smoked like heated steel. A slight tick quivered at the corner of her tight mouth, and for just an instant her expression touched him with fear. But she asserted control quickly and forced a smile as she saw the concern on his face. She started to say something else, but her half-raised hand stopped him, and he retreated once more into safe neutrality. Honor inhaled deeply, and then deliberately drew the white beret from her shoulder. She settled it precisely on her head without looking at Tankersley, but she felt the weight of his eyes. Courtesy forbid a visiting captain to wear the white beret when a guest upon another ship, and that made the gesture a calculated insult to the man she just left behind. She turned back to her guide, beret on her head, and those dark eyes challenged him to react. It was a challenge Tankersley declined, content to maintain his isolation as he escorted her silently back towards lift. Honor was grateful for his silence, for her brain was trying to grapple with too many thoughts at once. Memories of the academy dominated them, especially of the terrible scene in the commandant's office as Mr. Midshipman Lord Young, broken ribs and collarbone still immobilized, split lips still puffed and distended, one blackened eye swollen almost shut, was required to apologize to Miss Midshipman Harrington for his inappropriate language and actions before the official reprimand for conduct unbecoming went into the file. She should have told the whole story, she thought miserably, but he was the son of a powerful nobleman, and she was only the daughter of a retired medical officer, and not a particularly beautiful one either. Who would have believed the Earl of North Hollow's son had assaulted and attempted to rape a gawky, overgrown lump of a girl who wasn't even pretty? Besides, where was her proof? They'd been alone. Young had seen to that, and she'd been so shaken she'd fled back to her dorm room instead of reporting it instantly. By the time anyone knew a thing about it, his cronies had dragged him off to the infirmary with some story about falling down the stairs on his way to the gym. And so she'd settled for the lesser charge, the incident that had happened earlier before witnesses, when she'd rebuffed his smugly confident advances. Perhaps if she hadn't been so surprised, so taken aback by his sudden interest and obvious assurance that she would agree, she might have declined more gracefully. But it wasn't a problem she'd ever had before. She'd never developed the techniques for defining without affronting his overweening ego, and he hadn't taken it well. No doubt that slight to his pride was what had triggered later events, but his immediate response had been bad enough, and the Academy took a dim view of sexual harassment, especially when it took the form of insulting language and abusive conduct directed by a senior midshipman at a junior. Commandant Hartley had been furious enough with him over that, but who would have believed the truth? Commandant Hartley would have, she thought. She'd realized that years ago and hated herself for not telling him at the time. Looking back, she could recognize his hints on his all but overt pleas for him to tell her everything. If he hadn't suspected, he hardly would have required Young to apologize to her after she'd reduced him to a bloody pulp. Young had counted on neither the strength and reaction time Sphinx's gravity bestowed, nor the extra tutoring in unarmed combat Chief McDougal had been giving her, and she'd known better than to let him up after she had him down. He was only lucky that he'd tried for her in the showers when Nimitz wasn't around, for he would be a far less handsome today if the tree cat had been present. No doubt it was as well Nimitz hadn't been there, and she admitted there was a certain savage joy in hurting him herself for what he'd tried to do, but the response had been entirely out of proportion for his official offense, and no one had ever doubted that his fall had been nothing of the sort. Hartley might not have had any proof, but he would never have come down on Young so harshly under the circumstances if he hadn't had a pretty shrewd notion of what had actually happened. Yet she hadn't realized that then, and she told herself she'd already dealt with the matter anyway, that she didn't want to precipitate a scandal that could only hurt the Academy, that it was a case of at least said soon as mended, since no one would have believed her anyway, bad enough to be involved in something so humiliating and degrading without exposing herself to that as well. She'd almost been able to hear the sniggers about the homely horse girl out of a girl and delusions, and after all, hadn't she let herself get a little carried away? There'd been no need to pound him into semi-consciousness that had gone beyond simple self-defense into the realm of punishment. So she let the matter rest, and in so doing she'd brought herself the worst of both worlds. Attempted rape was one of the service's crash and burn offenses. If Young had been convicted of that, he would have never worn an officer's uniform. No, but he hadn't been. She hadn't gotten him out of service, and she made an enemy for life, for Young would never forget that she'd beaten him bloody, nor would he ever forgive her for the humiliation of being forced to apologize to her before Commandant Hartley and his executive officer, and he had powerful friends, both in and out of the service. She'd felt their influence more than once in her career, and his malicious delight in dropping full responsibility for the entire Basilisk station system on her soldiers, leaving her with a single, overaged light cruiser to do a job which should have been the task of an entire flotilla, burned on her tongue like a poison. It was petty and vicious, and entirely in keeping with his personality. She inhaled deeply as the lift reached the boat bay, and its doors opened once more. She regained enough of her composure to shake Tankersley's hand, and made herself sound almost normal as she bade him farewell and boarded her cutter once more. She settled back in her seat as the cutter separated from Warlock and headed back to Fearless, and her mind reached out to grapple with her crew's reaction to this latest development. No doubt they would see Warlock's departure as one more sign that they'd been demoted to the least important duty that the fleet could find and abandoned, and they would soon realize just how heavy a burden Young had dropped on them. Her single ship would be required to police the entire system and all of the traffic passing through Basilisk Terminus, and there was no way they could do it. They couldn't be in enough places at once, and trying to would impose a mind and body-numbing strain on all of them, which was exactly what Young had intended. He was leaving her an impossible job, content in the knowledge that her failure to discharge it would go into her record. Unlike him, honor had yet to make the list, and if she botched her first independent command, however it had fallen on her, she never would. But she hadn't botched it yet, and she nodded to herself, a choppy, angry nod, even knowing that Young had set her up, that he intended for her to fail and ruin herself was better than serving under his command, she told herself. Let him take himself off to Manticore. The sooner he got out of the same system as her, the better she'd like it. And of one thing she was certain, she couldn't do any worse at the job than he had. She'd made a mistake once when he was concerned. She wouldn't let him push her into another. Whatever it took, she would discharge her duties and meet her own responsibilities, not just to protect her career, but because they were her duties and her responsibilities, because she would not let an aristocratic piece of scum like Pavel Young win. She straightened her spine and looked down at the data chip of her orders, and her dark brown eyes were dangerous. Chapter 7. The officers in the captain's briefing room just off Fearless's bridge rose as Honor came through the hatch. She waved them back into the chairs and crossed to her own, her movements brisk and intense. She sat and turned to face them, and her eyes were expressionless. Ladies and gentlemen, she began without preamble, Warlock will be departing for Manticore for refit within the hour. McKean sat straighter in supplies, but she kept her voice cool and level, almost clipped as she went on. Captain Young will be accompanying her, which will leave Fearless, the only queen ship in the system, and myself as senior officer. She allowed herself a small smile at the almost sound of dismay that swept through the compartment, but her eyes were ice. She tried motivating them through opportunity and pride in self, and hit his own well. Very well. If they wouldn't respond to her invitations to meet their responsibilities for their own self-worth, she would try other means. Needless to say, this will leave us with a great many commitments, many of them mutually contradictory. This, however, is a queen's ship. We will discharge our responsibilities, or I will know the reason why. Is that clear? Those cold brown eyes seemed to impale each of them in turn, and McKean moved slightly in his chair as they lingered on him. His chin rose, but he said nothing, and she nodded. Good. In that case, let's move on to precisely what our duties and responsibilities are, shall we? She punched buttons on her terminal at the head of the conference table, and a small-scale hollow display of the Basilisk system bloomed above it. She manipulated more buttons, and a bright red cursor blinked to life. We have a single ship, ladies and gentlemen, and our problem, in the simplest terms, is that one ship can be in only one place at a time. The fleet is responsible for supporting Basilisk control and management of junction through traffic, including customs inspections as required. In addition, we are responsible for inspection of all traffic within Medusa itself, or with the planet's orbital facilities for supporting the resident commissioner and her native protection agency relief, for safeguarding all extra-Medusan visitors in the planet, and for ensuring the security of the system against all external threats. To accomplish this, we must be here. The cursor blinked in orbital proximity to Medusa. Here, it blinked amid the flowing beads of traffic around the junction terminus, and, in fact, here. The cursor swept a wide circuit of the system, right on the 20 light-minute radius of the G5 star hyperlimit. She let the red light circle the hollow's display central star for several seconds, then killed the cursor and folded her hand before her on the tabletop. Obviously, ladies and gentlemen, a single light cruiser can't be in all those places at once. Nonetheless, I have my orders from Captain Young, and I will discharge them. McKean sat silent, staring at her in disbelief. She couldn't be serious, as she herself had just proven no single ship could discharge them. But she obviously meant to try, and his cheeks burned as he realized what she'd been doing in her quarters over the 3 hours since her return from Warlock. She'd been tackling her impossible assignment by herself, wrestling with it without even attempting to involve her officers in its solution, for they'd proven that she couldn't. He'd proven that she couldn't. His hands gripped together under the table. The final responsibility would have been Harrington's in any case, but captains and officers, and especially first officers, specifically to help them in situations like this. More, McKean had already grasped the malice behind her new orders. He'd suspected there was something between her and Young. Now he knew there was. Young was running a grave risk with his own career by quitting his station, though it seemed likely he had the patronage and influence to stave off outright disaster. But if Harrington failed to discharge the responsibilities he dumped on her, however impossible, he shivered internally and made himself concentrate on her words. Lieutenant Venizelos. Yes, ma'am. You will select 35 ratings and 1 junior officer for a detached duty. Fearless will escort Warlock to the terminus. As soon as Warlock has departed, I will drop you, your chosen personnel, and both pinnaces. You will rendezvous with Basilisk Control and assume the duty of Customs and Security Officer for the terminus traffic. You will be attached to the Basilisk Control for the purpose until further notice. Understood? Venizelos gawked at her for a moment, and even McKean blinked. It was unheard of, but it just might work, he admitted almost unwillingly. Unlike cutters, pinnaces were large enough to mount impeller drives and inertial compensators, and they were armed. Their weapons might be pop guns and slingshots compared to regular warships, but they were more than sufficient to police unarmed merchantmen. Yet Venizelos was only a lieutenant, and he would be 10 hours calm time from his commanding officer. He'd be entirely on his own, and one wrong decision on his part could ruin not only his career, but Harrington's as well, which certainly explained his white, strained expression. The captain sat motionless, eyes on Venizelos' face, and her mouth tightened ominously. One tapering forefinger tapped the tabletop gently, and the tactical officer shook himself visibly. Yes, ma'am. Understood. Good. Honor regarded him levelly for another moment, tasting his anxiety and uncertainty, and made herself step firmly on her compassion. she thought mordantly. If he screwed up, Pablo Young and his cronies would see to it that she paid the price for it, not Venizelos. Not that she intended to tell a young lieutenant that. I will leave you detailed instructions, she told him, relenting just a bit, and he sighed in what he clearly thought was unobtrusive relief, then stiffened again as she added, but I will expect you to exercise your own discretion and initiative as the situation requires. He nodded again, unhappily, and she turned her hard eyes on Dominica Santos. Commander Santos? Yes, Captain. The Lieutenant Commander looked much calmer than Venizelos has, possibly because she knew there was no way Honor would detail her chief engineer for detached duty. I want you to confer with Lieutenant Venizelos before his departure. Get with the exec as well. Before the lieutenant leaves us, I want a complete inventory of our on-hand recon drones. She paused, and Santos nodded as she tapped a note into her memo pad. Yes, ma'am. May I ask the purpose of the inventory? You may. Once you've completed it, I want you and your department to begin stripping the sensor head from the missile bodies in order to fit them with simple station-keeping drives and astrogation packages. This time Santos looked up quickly, her composure noticeably cracked. I imagine we can do the job by swapping the sensor heads into the standard warning and navigation beacons. If not, I want to design for a system that will work on my desk by 1300. She locked eyes with the engineer, and Santos flinched. She hid her dismay well, but Honor could almost feel her racing thoughts as the magnitude of her task loomed before her. Just the man-hours involved were daunting, and if she had to define from scratch. As soon as we've dropped Lieutenant Venizelos and his party, as Honor continued in that same flat, cold voice, Fearless will begin a globular sweep pattern 10 light minutes from Basilisk. Lieutenant Stromboli, the astrogator, started in his chair as her glance moved to him, will work out a least time course for us, and we will deploy our drones as stationary sensor platforms. I realize that we will almost certainly have insufficient drones for complete coverage, but we'll concentrate on the ecliptic. We can't make patrol sweeps by the boat with only one ship, but we can cover the most likely approach vectors. You want us to fit all of them with station-keeping drives, ma'am? Santos asked after a moment. That's what I said, Commander. What? The engineer caught Honor's glacial glance and changed what she'd been about to say. I expect you're right about fitting the sensor heads into standard beacon kits, ma'am, but the numbers you're talking about are going to clean out our kits in a hurry. We're going to have to scratch-build an awful lot of drives and astro packs. That's not going to be cheap, and I don't even know if we have sufficient spares about. What we don't have, we'll fabricate. What we can't fabricate, we'll requisition from Basilisk Control. What we can't requisition, we'll steal. Honor bared her teeth in a humorless smile. Is that clear, Commander Santos? Yes, ma'am. A point, Captain, Mickey heard himself say, and Honor and Harrington's eyes whipped to his face. They seemed to harden a bit more, but there was wariness, and perhaps a trace of surprise in them as well. Yes, exactly. I'm not certain how many probes we have in stores, ma'am, but I am certain that you're right about our inability to achieve complete coverage, even if we can. I mean, even after we have fitted them all with station-keeping drives. He was speaking stiffly, and he knew it, but he was also contributing to the solution of a problem for the first time since Harrington had come on board. It felt odd, unnatural, and the captain prompted him. We also have the problem of their endurance, ma'am. They were never intended for a long-term deployment like this, but we might be able to increase their effective time on station by setting them for burst activation. They've got a passive detection range of just over 20 light minutes against an active impeller drive. If they're on the 10-minute light shell, they'll have a reach of over a half light hour from the primary. Call it 40 minutes flight time. Honor nodded. The best radiation and particle shielding available still limited a ship to a maximum speed of 0.8 C in normal space. If we set them to come up for, say, 30 seconds every half hour, they should detect any incoming vessel under power in normal space at least 20 light minutes out. That should give us sufficient time to respond, and, at the same time, increase their endurance by a factor of 60. An excellent suggestion, exec. Honor smiled at him, grateful that he'd finally come out of his shell, and his facial muscles twitched as if to return it, but then they stiffened again as if he regretted his momentary lapse, and she smothered a frown of her own. Lieutenant Venizelos, the tactical officer, looked positively harried as she turned back to him, and her smothered frown turned into a smothered smile at his expression. Yes, ma'am. Lieutenant Cardones will be taking over your responsibilities in your absence. In addition to your other duties before departure, I want you to get with him and work out the optimum drone deployment based on the availability figures I feel certain Commander Santos and Commander McKean will have for you within the hour. Yes, ma'am. Very well. Now, once we've detached the pinnaces and deployed our drones, I intend to place Fearless in Medusa's orbit. It will be necessary for me to meet and confer with the resident commissioner as soon as possible, which will, of course, require a visit to the planet. In addition, however, the detachment of our pinnaces will force us to rely on our cutters for all inspections of space-to-surface and orbit-to-orbit trade. Since they do not have impellers, we may be required to use Fearless herself to move them from orbit to orbit in order to cover all targets. Moreover, the planet lies within 3 light minutes of the inner edge of our drone deployment, and our onboard sensors have far more reach than the droids will. By remaining in Medusa's orbit, we will be so positioned as to allow our sensors to cover the most critical spatial volume of our responsibilities, and also free drones to thicken our portion of the net. I'll want at least one drone reserved to cover the planet if we leave orbit, as I intend to run periodic sweeps of the inner systems if possible, but I'm afraid we'll find ourselves too busy to make many of them. Is all of this understood? She sat back and swept them with her eyes. Most of them nodded. None shook their heads. Excellent. In that case, Captain. Yes, Lieutenant Venizelos. Something just occurred to me, ma'am. Commander McKean's right about probe turns, and even without that consideration, getting the kind of coverage you're talking about would be a real problem with the number we have aboard. We could get a lot better density if we ask Warlock to drop off any she can spare. I mean, it's not like she's going to be needing them in Mandacor. I appreciate the suggestion, Honor said in an absolutely toneless voice, but I'm afraid it's impractical. We'll just have to do the best we can with from our own resources. But, Captain, I said it's impractical, Lieutenant. Her voice was even flatter than before, its very lack of expression a warning, and Venizelos closed his mouth with a snap. He shot a helpless, sidelong glance at McKean, but the exec didn't even blink. He'd already noticed that Arrington planned to detach her pinnaces after the heavy cruiser and Young had departed. Now her responses to Venizelos confirmed his reading of the situation. Whatever the source of the bad blood between her and Young, it was nasty enough for him to deliberately set her up for disaster, and for her to see it coming, and to take steps against it only after he was no longer in a position to frustrate them, all of which sounded ominously as though HMS Fearless and her officers might just find themselves caught in the crossfire. Honor watched her executive officer's mask-like expression and guessed what was going on behind it. He was right, of course, and so was Venizelos. She deeply regretted having stepped on the tactical officer so hard, especially when he'd only offered the sort of succession she practically prayed for her officers to make. But she couldn't explain the enmity between her and Young, even if it had been unthinkable for any commanding officer to reveal such a thing to her subordinates. It would have sounded entirely too much like petulant whining. Are there any other comments and suggestions? She asked after a moment. There were none, and she nodded. I will announce our new orders and responsibilities to the ship's company at 1400. Lieutenant Venizelos, I'll want a list of the personnel you want for your party by 1300. Commander McKean will vet them before you submit them to me, but I want a final approval made before I address the crew. Yes, ma'am. Very well, ladies and gentlemen, you have your instructions. Let's be about them. She nodded, and they rose and hurried from their compartment. They didn't look very happy, but at least they were actively engaged with their duties for the first time in far too long. Perhaps that was a good sign. The hatch closed behind the last of them, and she put her elbows on the table and buried her face in her palms, massaging her temples with her fingertips. God, she hoped it was a good sign. She'd done her best to radiate confidence, but a terrifying number of things could go wrong. Merchant skippers could be prickly about their rite of passage, and Venizelos might provoke an interstellar incident if you pressed the wrong captain too hard. Even with McKean's its suggestion the endurance of their competent sensor platforms would be frighteningly limited. They might last 3 months. They might last the 3 months until Warlock returned, with luck, if Young didn't find some excuse to extend his refit even further. And, worst of all of her plans counted on nothing going seriously wrong anywhere. If something did break, she had an excellent chance of knowing about it, but she had an even better chance of being in entirely the wrong place to do anything to stop it. She sighed and straightened, then lowered her hands to the table and stared long and hard at the back. In the final analysis, everything depended on her crew, and she hated to think about the strain she was about to impose upon them. Marines would be of limited utility to Venezuela, so the tactical officer would almost certainly ask solely for naval ratings. That meant he would be taking almost 10% of Fearless's ship company with him, and she would have a very hard time denying him the best 10% with the most small craft experience. Her own custom parties for orbital traffic would have to come from what was left, and she'd already noted an appalling number of merchantmen in New Medusa orbit. What they could be finding to trade with aborigines was beyond her imagination, but they were clearly trading a lot of something, and it would be her duty to check every one of those ships. It would be tempting, she knew, to settle for a simple examination of their manifests, but that wasn't what the fleet expected of her. Manifest checks would do for through traffic entering the system, only to transit the junction. In case of vessels trading with Mandagoran territory, however, those transshipping cargo here, she was supposed to inspect the cargo shuttles and ships themselves for contraband. That meant long, grueling hours for her people, and each inspection party would require an officer or senior petty officer to command it. Even if she had to make no other detachments, that was going to leave her chronically short-handed, and she could almost see the domino effect rippling towards her. Too few people meant longer watches, less free time, and more resentment from a crew that was already hostile at a time when she needed absolute top effort from everyone on board. She sighed again and stood, looking around the empty compartment. So be it. Her own nature and all of her training cried out for her to lead, but if leadership failed, she would cajole, kick, bully, or terrorize. One way or another, whatever it took, she would get it done. They could hate her guts all they liked, as long as they did their duty.